Calgary's move to blanket rezone most of the city's residential areas to allow for higher density housing hasn't been met with a blanket of approval from residents. It's pushed some communities to go over the city's head, in a sense, and embrace a bit of an old school legal contract, the restrictive covenant. It's a tool that lets property owners drop their own rules about what their neighborhoods can look like, which sounds good on paper. But in practice, can there be a downside to turning back to this way of planning out communities?
Well, covenants are private arrangements about land use. We now use zoning for most land use regulation, but covenants predate zoning, and they were used historically not only to protect private amenities, but public amenities as well.
Many older covenants were created when land was subdivided from an empty field to a full-blown community. Back in the day, a covenant was the main way to organize land, differentiating from a residential area to commercial and so on. They had the same function as modern zoning bylaws, but instead of being put in place and decided by a city council and enforced at the municipal level, they're private agreements. The agreements are attached to land titles, usually as a group, so one community might have dozens of land titles with the same restrictive covenant on file. These agreements can spell out a whole host of rules and obligations, things you must follow or face consequences. More on that later. The rules in some cases can get pretty specific, down to the color of the house or garage door. Unlike a municipal land use, you can't ask city council to change or update a restrictive covenant. It's a private agreement, so it's not the city you need to go through, but the law. Enforcement is carried out through civil court proceedings, and they tend to have staying power unless the agreement includes an expiry date moving with the title, sale after sale after sale. But the responsibility to enforce them comes down on the parties who have signed on.
Well, you have to be willing, or your community has to be willing to take the steps to enforce that restrictive covenant by bringing an application in court if you feel that it has been breached. Otherwise, restrictive covenants don't have teeth because neither the city nor the province will enforce them on your behalf.
Marble says his covenant-related workload has gone up dramatically in recent months. He's working with 15 different communities across the city to draw up agreements. Some of them restrict development to single-family homes, while others allow for things like secondary suites, and others are concerned about streetscape. So what the street looks like and the preservation of things like mature trees. So what is driving this? I went to speak to Joanne Atkins, who lives in the city's northwest. She lives on one of 3 streets in her community, currently in the process of drafting a restrictive covenant.
Essentially, if you sign a restrictive covenant, you're really protecting your neighbors as opposed to yourself. And in return, you appreciate it if they do the same. I think that prospective purchasers who are looking for this type of street are going to be looking for streets that have restrictive covenants to try to protect that. People who want the vibrancy and the bustle and the busyness of a denser, more inner city community, say, such as Hillhurst, they'll gravitate towards that community. And the people who want the parks in a more quiet setting are going to gravitate to communities like ours. And people who want the suburban lifestyle will gravitate there. So it really is just protecting a certain type of residential development.
To her, it's a selling feature, one that developers might not appreciate, but home buyers might want and might have trouble finding in the future. This is where we get into the flip side. Covenants can be divisive. The legal documents have, in the past, been used as a tool of racial segregation, not just in the US, but in Canada too. While that's not how they're used today, one expert told me they could still create divides.
There's a strong kind of class dynamic within the use of restrictive covenants. Will it arrest development, or will it just move stuff around so that the people who don't have lawyers and don't have money and don't have resources are the ones then that become the most susceptible to land use change?
Then there's the lasting power. A lot can change in decades and centuries. Can property owners of today really have a vision for what stands the test of time?
They're saying the way they like the land use is the way that the land use should be. And that may not always be like a net benefit to a homeowner. You're basically giving away development rights. And you're doing it in a way that makes it hard to untangle.
That's why I say that the advantage of covenants is also their disadvantage, that they tend to endure. And when homeowners decide to register a covenant, they usually do so with the help of a lawyer, and it's the job of the lawyer to advise them as to all the pros and cons of entering into the covenant.
The experts I spoke to doubt this covenant renaissance will stand in the way of development, at least in any noticeable way. They feel it's more of a commentary to councillors and urban planners making decisions about how Calgary should develop and what that should look like.
They leave some planning decisions to private owners instead of the planning authorities. So administration can say, this is our vision for the city, and some owners will say, that's wonderful, but we have a different vision for our neighborhood. And assuming that these two different visions can coexist, zoning and covenants can also coexist.
The two visions might also butt heads as Calgary grows and changes.
We are going to very likely see developers challenge those restrictive covenants, either the historical ones or the ones that I've registered, and test their enforceability in court.
Those tests can take time, tying up development as the courts decide whether to enforce the covenant or not. Helen Pike, CBC News, Calgary.